Hello, everyone. Welcome to this second panel discussion at the conference today. My name is Tamara Kharoub. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And I am chairing the discussion for this session titled Prospects for Political Reform, Centering Human Security and Human Rights in the Middle East and North Africa. As many of you know, more than a decade ago, people in the Arab world rose against authoritarianism and demanded rights, freedoms, and opportunities. But the prospects for change and democratic transformation today are very grim. 10 years later, we are witnessing greater repression in the region, protracted and violent conflict, millions of refugees, military coups, and hyper-securitization, and entrenched authoritarianism, all enabled by geopolitical shifts, evolving security and military alliances, and changing international priorities. And we've heard a little about that during the day today. This renewed focus on security and regime survival has exacerbated the situation of human rights and human security in the region. And yet, we have observers, analysts, politicians, and the media celebrating this new era of cooperation and peace and de-escalation. But this tension or juxtaposition between regime security and human security is not new. Traditional approaches to the region have often been security-centric in the military sense and policing as well, without it really addressing the political, economic, and human rights grievances of the populations in the region. Today, people in MENA continue to suffer from grave human rights violations, lack of access to basic services and needs, including water, food, healthcare, safety, and humanitarian aid, deteriorating economic crises, rampant corruption, and the impacts of climate change and conflict. We can't talk about long-term stability and de-escalation without addressing the human dimension and the underlying causes. As such, in this session, for the next 90 minutes, we will discuss the current state of human security and human rights in the MENA region, the challenges presented by geopolitical shifts and security alliances, and the prospects as well as recommendations for democratic transition and government reforms. To address these important issues, we have a great and excellent panel of experts joining us today. Thank you to all four of them for being here. I will briefly introduce them in speaking order, but you can find their full bios on our website. First, we have Mayis Saadani, who is the Executive Director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEP. Yara Asi is the Assistant Professor in the School of Global Health Management and Informatics at the University of Central Florida. She is also a non-resident Senior Fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Marwa Daoudy is Associate Professor of International Relations at the School of Foreign Service and the Seif Ghobash Chair in Arab Studies at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, both at Georgetown University. And she is also a member of the Academic Advisory Board at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Ahmed Mursi is a senior researcher with the Middle East and North Africa program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to your interventions. I will give each of the speakers about 10 to 12 minutes to present their remarks, and then we will have 30 minutes to take questions from the online audience. Please do submit your questions at any time during the discussion. For those of you in the room, you have these question cards in front of you. Please use them, write your questions legibly, please, and raise your card, and one of our staff members will collect the question cards. For those joining us online, you can send in your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. And with that, we will start the discussion with Mayis Saadani. May, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for setting up this conversation. Across the Middle East and North Africa, we're seeing, I think, what I would describe as a really incredible deterioration in the relationship between the state and society. And with it has really come a deterioration in the rule of law and the state of human rights as well, the human rights of everyday citizens, and particularly, of course, the human rights of vulnerable groups. In many of the region's countries, authorities are increasingly acting like they are entitled to power. And the concern for them is more about how they can consolidate power and consolidate their control, and less about what they can offer citizens, or in fact, what citizens are owed, which is traditionally how we think about the role of the state. In fact, there's an attitude almost of them doing citizens a favor. You see this in the example of Egyptian President Sisi's comments, who's made comments effectively blaming citizens for their own poverty, for the state of the economic situation, rather than really advancing economic solutions that could address some of these root issues. And there are multiple examples around the region. In my opening remarks, and I will keep them short because I'm eager to jump into discussion, I think there's a lot of touch points between all of our contributions. I'm going to focus a bit on the space for expression, assembly, and association, which I think is a really critical way through which to understand the state of human rights. I'll talk about the state of accountability and how governments are seeing accountability, what all of this has meant for regional security and stability, and what the response of civil society has been. So starting with the space for expression, assembly, and association, I think we're absolutely seeing a severe tightening of the space across the region. There's less opportunity for people to take to the streets to protest. There is less space for journalists to produce independent media coverage, for everyday citizens to take to social media and express their dissent. Even at times for citizens who have left the country as refugees or diaspora or exiled folks to even express themselves and organize. And there's a few phenomena that I really want to touch on here. I'm going to touch on 5 things in this area. The first is one of the trends we're seeing as to how authorities have been restricting the space for expression, association, and assembly is really weaponization of legislation. So the fascinating thing about the authoritarian governments in the region is we often think of the MENA region as lacking rule of law. Who cares about the law sort of thing? Violations are happening on a regular basis. But in actuality, many of the governments in the region are systemically passing legislation to normalize the violations that they carry out. So instead of arresting protesters in an ad hoc manner, they issue a protest law, which makes it illegal to protest. And you ask what the value of this as a tactic is. I think there's a number of values, but one of them is certainly to systematize and normalize repression. And another, I think, is to really change the perception of the society. There's actually interesting sociological research that looks at 10 years after a law has been passed, what that does to the society. If you look at, we've had in Egypt a protest law for 10 plus years. Interesting to ask Egyptians how they feel about protests, how they see it as a destabilizing force, what that has really done to which something was a right, something that was celebrated at the January 25 revolution is now something that we view as suspect. And the law absolutely has a part to play in that. And so over the last few years, we've really seen a number of categories of laws, which I think we can spend hours talking about, but I'll kind of list off. And I think you'll find they're present in a number of countries in the region. Certainly protest and gathering laws, like I've mentioned in this example. Media laws, which restrict the ability of media outlets to register or the ability of them to cover certain official statements. Counterterrorism laws, and I'll jump into that in a second. Cybercrime laws as well. And so these are the types of kind of arsenal of legislation that authorities have at their disposal to be able to systematize and normalize the closure of space, which of course has implications for the human rights of everyday individuals, but also has an impact on expression at large and the space for organizing, the space for innovation, dissent, so many other things. It also bleeds into the economic situation, which I'll talk about later. A second kind of phenomena I want to focus on is countering terrorism. And I think this is a framework that has grown quite a bit. Certainly since 9/11, the US, of course, is the architect of a lot of the counterterrorism framework, but that has been adopted by Arab countries across the region, and really they've run with it. And we're seeing a situation where, unfortunately, a number of nonviolent individuals are being designated and recognized as terrorists. And this becomes a card that becomes that much harder to push back on. Once you, as a journalist or a civil society activist or a lawyer, are called a terrorist, it's that much harder to then fight for your due process rights or say, oh no, what you're doing is okay, et cetera. And with this counterterrorism designations, we've seen on procedures that take on really emergency nature. We've seen travel bans, asset freezes, defamation campaigns, closure of organizations, a whole host of things that you can imagine take place once we call someone or something a terrorist organization or terrorist. Third, I think the online space is really critical. There's a serious contestation of the online space. Like I mentioned earlier, cyber crimes have been passed as recent, the most recent one being the Jordanian cybercrime law, which you may have read about, but before it, the Tunisian cybercrime law, and before it, others as well. There's a draft going around now in Iraq. So this is a phenomena that we're literally seeing every Arab country think about how they can use this type of legislation. And in its essence, cybercrime laws, they're really meant to focus on things like identity theft, fraud, et cetera. But the real way in which we're seeing these laws be weaponized is to criminalize expression of various forms, to restrict the space for folks to speak on social media, to restrict the space for journalists to independently cover issues, to restrict the space to put out surveys or what have you. And so really, they've also become weapons, I would say, to restrict the space for free expression. And this is definitely an area I would be paying attention to because a lot of the cybercrime laws are quite similar. In fact, some of the provisions are word for word. And so it's clear that authoritarian governments are sharing notes. And this is a theme I'll come back to. We've also seen, along with the issuing of legislation in the online space, prosecutorial offices have actually set up social media monitoring units, which their job is to look at people's social media and find potential cases to bring against individuals. We've seen this in Saudi Arabia and some of the more recent cases that have been covered. We see it in Egypt. It's become a part of the legal framework. We've also, of course, seen the use of troll armies and bots to really cloud the discussion online. And of course, unfortunately, the use of surveillance and spyware. And we're seeing more and more countries buy into that surveillance and spyware, much of which is created by Israeli companies to bring it all together. Most recently, actually, an opposition candidate who's running in Egypt, Ahmed al-Tantawi, they found predator spyware on his phone, and Citizen Lab, which is the nonprofit that looked into the issue, says with high confidence that it was the Egyptians that bought this spyware. And so in the lead up to elections, which are scheduled to happen on December 10th, it's really alarming that we see this type of software being used in order, presumably, to collect incriminating information that could then be used to discourage opposition voices from running and contesting an election in an environment where, frankly, it's unlikely the opposition candidate would win in the first place. But again, it shows the psychology of this regime that wants to consolidate control. And so I think one last thing I'll say about the online space before I move on is also, of course, really important to look at the companies at the heart of this. Unfortunately, most of the companies of platforms, Twitter or X as it's now called, and others end up leaning in favor of the state. They don't sufficiently target hate speech, and so vulnerable groups, LGBT persons, refugees, experience more of the same, and they become even more vulnerable as a result. A fourth phenomenon I want to point to is that repression is now extending beyond the boundaries of the state. We have this concept of transnational repression, which is basically states targeting their citizens outside of their borders. And we see this in a variety of different ways. This is a phenomena that's been covered quite extensively by Freedom House and other organizations. But we see physical spies and sometimes the weaponization of embassies in key capitals to target opposition voices and scare them. We see phishing attempts and SIM card mirroring, which is meant to extend software into the phones of folks outside of the boundaries. And we also see the arrest of foreign nationals at the behest of foreign governments. Example, Egyptian activist Abdurrahman Tariq Moka, who was arrested temporarily in Lebanon and almost deported back at the behest of Egyptian officials. And then a final thing I want to point out in this area is like I said earlier, authoritarian governments and non-state actors are learning from each other. And I think here, I would be remiss if we didn't speak about normalization. I think normalization of the Syrian regime I'm speaking about. And I think normalization is thought of as a Syria issue, but it's really not a Syria issue. I think it sends an alarming message that you can commit some of the worst human rights violations of this day and age and be welcomed back into the international community with open arms. And so as states are welcoming Assad back, maybe some of them are doing so as a bulwark against Iran, like they say, but in actuality, others are also doing so because they see themselves in Assad as authoritarian regimes that have also committed violations. In a way, they see Assad as an extension of their theory, and protecting him is in a way protecting themselves. And so as we think about the ties between these governments, the ways in which they exchange knowledge, the ways in which they back up each other, I think that's really important as we reflect on the state of human rights in the region. And that takes me to the second part of what I wanted to touch on, which is the state of accountability and how governments in the region perceive it. I've given the example of expression, association, assembly, and as a kind of window into the state of human rights. But I think all of this really comes to the reality that these are governments that don't want to be held accountable. They don't want to be held accountable for the duties that they owe citizens. They don't want to be held accountable for the abuses they commit. And they build their legitimacy, in fact, on their ability to promise those who support them that they too won't be held accountable. And so as we see the work of organizations, be it documentation, legal work, investigative journalism, this is the stuff that we see as a red line. This is the stuff that gets people in trouble when they're working in their countries, because at the heart of it is a reminder that these states owe citizens something and they're not living up to what they're meant to be doing. And so naturally, you're seeing a growing number of lawyers behind bars across the MENA region. You're seeing folks at the heart of some of these accountability movements be targeted. You're seeing obstruction into judicial efforts that would otherwise hold police officers, prosecutors accountable. The ability of these governments to protect themselves from accountability is deeply existential to the longevity of this regime. And so naturally, in conflict situations, you're also seeing transitional justice really set to the side, saying, let's reach peace before we reach justice, when in actuality, the two are deeply intertwined. When you look at the examples of Libya, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, the justice conversations are ones that folks on the ground, that civil society deeply want to have, but these conversations are being sidelined at the government and international community quite intentionally. And I think this kind of brings it all together for me. So that we're in a situation where accountability is a red line. Maintaining the status quo is critical in order to extend the longevity of these governments, and they exercise a variety of different tools in order to do so. And here we are talking about security and human rights, which are often put kind of on opposite ends. But the reality is the vast majority of countries in MENA that have not been able to deliver on respect for political rights are also not delivering on social and economic rights. And I think this is because human rights, for me and for a lot of people in this room, are not piecemeal. They bleed into each other. When you don't create space for expression, you don't create the space for survey data to be collected, you don't create the space for alternate policies to be articulated, you don't create the space for debate, and so you don't end up with good policies, even on something as mundane as social protections or economic policy or what have you. And so the lines are quite tight. The state ends up being stagnant. It doesn't welcome new ideas. And so a lot of the same challenges continue to be repeated. At the end of the day, it was governance and rule of law issues that were at the heart of why Derna in Libya was not prepared to deal with the floods. And it was also at the heart of why Morocco's king was unable to properly respond to the earthquake in time. These are governance and rule of law issues that affect the day-to-day ability of people to survive, to live, and in some cases, to thrive. And as I conclude, I just want to end on a slightly more positive note, because I think a lot of what I've shared is doom and gloom. The reality is the situation for human rights has been deteriorating and governments are holding on stronger than ever. But I think on the flip side, civil society, various types of organizations on the ground, individuals are remaining resilient. There's a lot of interesting synergies that I think would be good to discuss in the discussion. We're seeing solidarity across country and theme. We're seeing regional learning, synergies across sectors. In Lebanon, for example, you have investigative journalists working with whistleblowers, working with lawyers, and these types of coordination mechanisms are the reason that Riyad Salameh was ultimately brought to trial in Europe and why he was sanctioned. So kind of these sort of creative linkages are being built. People are remaining creative more than ever. And I think CSOs are especially thinking about what's worked and what hasn't. They know more than ever that the situation on the ground has changed and that the tactics of the past are not working and that we need kind of creative ways. And so in the absence of domestic remedies at home, some of these groups have been exploring different pathways to justice. They've explored the use of foreign courts, as we've seen in the Syria case. They have toyed with the concept of universal and extraterritorial jurisdiction. They've talked about targeted human rights and anti-corruption sanctions, expanding what justice means, thinking about reparations. There's so many interesting and dynamic conversations happening, and ultimately they point to a refusal to accept the status quo and an insistence on the fact that human rights are existential to the future of the region and to the stability of the region, and that these groups and these voices are here to stay. So I'll stop here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, May, for this excellent overview. That certainly, as you mentioned, we're seeing trends across the region and learning from each other. Greater lack of accountability, weaponization of legislation to close spaces for activists, human rights defenders, journalists, any dissidents in any way. And in this sense, it's an entrenchment of this authoritarian axis that's emerging, not only in the region, but globally. Next, we have Yara, who will tell us more about human security in the region.
Thank you. And thank you, May. I think that was a sobering introduction to this panel. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you, of course, to the Arab Center for the invitation. Keeping in mind the topic of our panel today, I'm going to try to cover a few issues in my allotted time, including the situation facing women and youth in Arab societies, health and development in the region, the realities of human security, and ultimately, if I have time, what governments should be doing, can be doing, and in many cases are purposefully not doing. So I want to first start by emphasizing how all of these seemingly disparate topics are interrelated, because we kind of tend to silo these things when we talk about human security and security in general. In 1994, the United Nations Development Program released their annual Human Development Report, and these reports, they're always kind of organized around some principal theme for that year. And in 1994, this theme was New Dimensions of Human Security. And this report traces human development over time, and it discusses the many ways that humanity, I think we all agree, has advanced beyond what could have been imagined even not that long ago in so many ways. But today, our concept of security kind of seems stuck in time. It's this definition of national security. When you say security, that's what people think. And when I say national security, what are you thinking about? You're thinking about militaries, you're thinking about borders, you're thinking about something military adjacent. But despite all the investment in the US, in the Middle East, in Russia, across the world, and emphasis that's placed on this one form of security, I mean, arguably, we are all feeling more insecure than ever, especially post-COVID, rising authoritarianism, et cetera. And we've limited human security to this security that centers the state and its borders and not the people living in the state. So we never consider national security to include job security or food security or water security, security that you will not be sexually harassed at work, security that you will not be discriminated against for your race or your citizenship status, security, like May was talking about, to freely associate, to gather, to criticize your state without recourse. And, you know, obviously we're not doing so great on these fronts. I just want to quickly read the first paragraph of this report to you. Quote, Behind the blaring headlines of the world's many conflicts and emergencies, there lies a silent crisis, a crisis of underdevelopment, of global poverty, of ever-mounting population pressures, of thoughtless degradation of environment. This is not a crisis that will respond to emergency relief or to fitful policy interventions. It requires a long, quiet process of sustainable human development, unquote. And again, this is from 1994. So it seems like any one of us in this room, I think, could have written this today. Unfortunately, we didn't heed this advice. And it's tough to find a region that performs worse than the Middle East, North Africa region. So let's start with this topic of women's security in the MENA region. And arguably, there has been a lot of movement with regard to women's rights in recent decades. We've seen female literacy increasing, we've seen fertility rates decreasing, and we know that that's linked to greater educational and employment and freedom in general for women. And looking around the region, in most universities, you're increasingly seeing women be the majority population. But a lot of these social changes and these kind of leaps forward were only possible because the region started at such a deficit. So for example, in 2018, you had Saudi Arabia allowing women to drive, and this was kind of so lauded in the West. Look at this new young prince, he's changing everything. With the, forgetting or not acknowledging, the guardianship laws that do still exist, and what happened to the women who were on the front lines of allowing women to drive. We can't just look at the outcome. We have to kind of look at the process. So we see many laws and norms across the region still preventing the free movement of women, the ability for women to be employed in certain fields, to start their own businesses. The MENA region has the lowest female labor force participation in the world to this day. And in fact, women's unemployment is increasing, and this is likely tied to COVID because we're kind of seeing that across the world. And women in the MENA region also report the highest burden of unpaid caregiving in the world at a rate of 5 to 1 that of men. And what is this? This is caring for children, for elderly family members, for disabled family members, purchasing and preparing food, managing the household, this kind of labor that is unacknowledged, kind of assumed to be the work of women, and undervalued, unpaid, etc. When it comes to government response to these issues, it does not help, certainly, that most of these countries are run and have always been run almost entirely by men. The region has just one female prime minister. About 20% of parliament members across the region are women. And when you look at the Gulf, it's closer to 10%. I don't want to single out MENA here because, let's be honest, no country in the world has really done well when it comes to gender equity in government and in halls of power, wherever they are, including the one we're sitting in now. But we have a region here that is in crisis. It needs all the energy and creativity and ability of all its population. And so to continually marginalize about half that population, despite, of course, exceptions that do rise up and do achieve, beyond their potentially their station, this is not a region where we are really seeing significant movement on gender equity, I think, in a meaningful way. It should not be seen as a social cause that's kind of a nice to have or a luxury. It should be seen as an existential priority, in my opinion. So speaking of lack of representation, aside from being run almost entirely by men, we also have diplomatically, many of the leaders in the region are significantly older than the populations that they're governing. This is a very young region, an extremely young region. The median age in most countries in the region is in the early 20s. And they are led by some of the oldest leaders in the world, not just in terms of age, but in terms of how long they have been in power. Many of the people governing the region and the youth of today were in power when those youth were children. Many of them were in power when their parents, were youth. So they have never had the opportunity to vote in a legitimate election, many of them, or at all in many countries. And this is an obvious and clear threat to their security and their ability to advocate for their needs, for that social contract with the state. Secondarily, as I think someone mentioned in the first panel, a high concentration of unemployed or underemployed, disaffected youth with zero trust in the state and little hope for the future is certainly not a recipe for security of any kind, let alone national security. And we really do see high unemployment for many youth in this region. Again, another record for the MENA region, the highest youth unemployment rates in the world, almost double the global average, around 30%. And in fact, this is the only region where unemployment rates increase with higher attainment of education. The World Bank estimates that the region needs 300 million more jobs within the next 25 years just to meet the employment demands of today's youth that are growing. And what about future generations, you know? So you have these ambitious students, they're attending university, they're trying to do their part, and yet they graduate and there's nowhere for them to go. And on top of that, they see that many of the good quality jobs that exist are, you know, there's nepotism, elitism, favoritism, all these factors weighing in much more prominently than merit, which is what they've kind of been told to pursue. So many of them, what do? They leave. This is a huge threat to the region in all levels. If the doctors and the lawyers and the engineers and the artists and the writers and the photographers and fill in the blank, if they're all leaving to find opportunity elsewhere, this is taking capital directly out of countries that don't have much social capital to lose. Arab youth have a huge role in the future of their countries, and they're living in countries where their basic needs are not being met and there's no serious effort to meet them. So this is happening, and this will come to a head as the youth of today become the leaders and the adults of tomorrow. And so one of these very basic needs that's not being met is health, and this is the last thing I'll address. Why is health important? Frequently, I see issues of health and well-being overlooked in conversations of politics and foreign policy. Again, it's kind of this siloed issue like health, education, economy, right? It's its own thing. But I think we all recognize that that's not in reality how health works. I'll defer to the words of Rudolf Virchow. He's known as the founder of modern pathology and the study of social medicine, who said that, quote, "Medicine is a social science and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale," unquote. So I think it's important that we actually see health outcomes as some of the most important barometers of not just healthy people, but the health of states. I don't think I need to tell the people in this room that this is an unhealthy region, not just in governance and infrastructure, and all those kind of topics. I'll leave that to many of my colleagues to discuss, but the people are unhealthy. We have an unhealthy population across, this is a very diverse region, right? So in a lot of our conversations today, we're kind of grouping everybody together, but when you drill down, there's diversity in why and how these things are happening. If you're in Gaza or Syria, maybe you're being bombed. If you're in Yemen or Somalia, you're being starved. If you're in the Gulf, you're experiencing type 2 diabetes because of this adoption of more Western diets, little physical activity. These are really disparate issues that require different types of policies, short-term, long-term investment in schools, in hospitals, in training. These are holistic problems. We see some of these issues in the most wealthy and supposedly stable and developed countries in the world. So how are we to even begin to think about how to deal with them across MENA? But looking at how people become ill or die tells you a lot about the country and its priorities. Many aspects of human security are directly tied to our ability to live healthy lives. And we consider that part of a dignified life, right? It's not just survival we want people to have, it's dignity. So when a country deprioritizes health, along with all these other authoritarian things they're doing, they're giving a very clear signal to the citizen that they don't care about them. They are not a priority. They are a unit in an economic engine. And if they do anything against that, then they need to be suppressed or oppressed. And people feel that very deeply when it comes to their own health or the health of a family member. Again, just as with marginalizing women, you cannot have a vibrant, strong country that can rise to meet many, many challenging crises if you don't have a healthy and strong population and vibrant population. Arab countries across the board invest about 5% of GDP on average. This is very low, even considering low-income countries. So this is one of those other short-sighted decisions that will ripple into the generations. So very briefly, what can be done about these huge systemic problems? That's always the issue when you attend these kinds of panels, right? Offering genuine human security is extremely challenging. There's no country, you know, you can look at Scandinavian countries, you can talk about Switzerland, you can look at all the examples, but no country has really eradicated poverty, eradicated homelessness, achieved gender parity, right? So MENA is an outlier on some of these issues, but these are global trends that we need to see movement on. I think, you know, it's easy to say end the wars and get rid of the authoritarians, but I don't think that's a satisfying recommendation, A, because it's difficult for all of the reasons we've talked about today, and B, even if you do that, you still need to build something in their absence. So what is that going to be? One thing that I've heard from many people in the space is reform and investment in education and healthcare, how people are educated in the region, not just that they get education, but consistently you talk to students in the region and they say, I am not being taught what I need to know to succeed. I'm not being taught critical thinking skills. There's still a very high emphasis on memorization and rote kind of, you know, teaching styles in the region. I mean, why are we still doing the tawjihi? You know, these are not helpful elements. And we need to invest in healthcare, how we train people, how we deliver healthcare. Humanitarian agencies that work in these countries, even well-intentioned, you know, they are not accountable to the people. Nothing replaces responsive governments when it comes to these issues, but they can fill in gaps more thoughtfully. And lastly, we need concentrated efforts on gender equity and on youth-related issues. When it comes to gender equity at current rates, the economic gender gap won't close for another 142 years. We can't afford to wait that long, I think, considering the current changes. So, and then looking at youth at the region, it's not just give them jobs when they graduate. They need parks to play in and art classes, and they need examples of good governance. And there's a lot of different needs that the region needs, specifically starting with responsive governments. This is the only way a citizen or a resident can feel secure in the place where they're living. And there's no replacement for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Yara. Thank you for highlighting this important issue of human development or lack thereof. And the growing human insecurity in the region, especially for marginalized populations. Next, we have Marwa, and we're switching gears a little bit, and we're talking about the impact of climate change and climate injustice on the populations of the region. Marwa, go ahead.
Thank you, Tamara, and thank you to the Arab Center in Washington for the invitation and for very interesting discussions. We heard from May and Yara about the very bleak state of affairs when it comes to the respect of human rights, the preservation of the dignity of the populations, the civilians, and also the prospects for human, political, social, and economic security. So it's an issue of insecurity, but it's also an issue of injustice. Now, another aspect of human insecurity, and Yara has outlined the meaning and definition very eloquently, is environmental. More specifically, climate risk assessments produced by the IPCC caution that the region is a hotspot, a climate hotspot. And we've seen in recent years the impacts, the devastating impacts of climate change with, like, for example, 2020 flooding ravaging Egypt, Iran, Sudan, and Tunisia, wildfires spreading in Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. And we know that Iraq and Syria both experienced the worst droughts in their history since more than 40 years for Iraq and 70 years in Syria. However, I would like to caution you today, there's nothing about environmental insecurity or climate insecurity which is apolitical. It's not separate from the reality of the politics of the region, anywhere actually, but specifically that region, elite preferences, repression, military and territorial occupation, and again, the disregard for the basic human rights of the civilians and the citizens, and again, the basic needs of the most vulnerable. So there are many impacts and ramifications when we think about environmental impacts, but also let's not forget that it's not only an external factor. There's underlying it, the responsibility of governments, the responsibility of their leaders. and also the political game that is being played by domestic and external actors. So in addition to experiencing the impacts of changing climate, the region has suffered protracted conflicts, armed conflicts, and instability in the past several decades. It's home to over 16 million refugees and internally displaced persons, and it has also contended with the significant presence of non-state actors, enduring the impacts of ongoing conflicts, also such as in Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and elsewhere. So when we talk about climate injustice affecting human security and human rights, it's about access to natural resources. It's about the depletion of these natural resources. It's also about impacting the livelihoods and the survival of a lot of these populations. It's also about the use and the misuse of the resources and the lack of access by many of these governments and actors, not allowing some of the populations to access the resources or using these resources as weapons in situations of armed conflict. I will be tackling now in my short presentation two interrelated issues: the impacts of armed conflicts, and we know the region has protracted conflicts, on the population's human and environmental security through access to resources, natural resources, and also the weaponization of these resources during the armed conflicts, which actually makes you think climate injustice and climate change is not only about a natural phenomenon. The other aspect, the other issue that I would like to discuss is when you have natural disasters such as earthquakes, and we've seen the devastating earthquakes in the past year in Syria, in Libya, and other areas. How are they managed? And again, the impacts are devastating when it comes to the weaponization also of natural disasters. So these are compounded threats which relate to human insecurity. We're talking about water, food insecurity, public health issues, and Yara, you talked about public health being very important, the rise of previously eradicated diseases such as cholera, polio, malaria, etc., which are part of this whole equation as well. Now, let me talk about the impacts of conflicts. The weaponization of resources and infrastructures during armed conflicts has become a dominant feature in these conflicts. It comes with increased human and environmental costs, of course. States and non-state actors have used water systems as weapons by transforming them into military tools and targeted key infrastructures during military operations, ultimately making them casualties of armed conflicts. And of course, who's paying the price? It is the civilians. I will focus on a few examples, concrete examples, and forgive me if I'm going to mention a lot of figures, but I think we need to put the facts really at the center of the discussion. I'll start with the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza. Since 1967, Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank have been prohibited from constructing water infrastructures without obtaining a permit from the Israeli army. So Israel's control over these resources has created very serious vulnerabilities for Palestinians in terms of accessing their water, in terms of water contamination as well. So clearly the Israeli forces have prioritized the existing groundwater, the aquifer, which is referred to as the mountain aquifer, which is the main source of groundwater in the West Bank, almost exclusively for their settlements, considered, we should be reminded, still considered as illegal under international law, in ways that further limit Palestinian access to their own water resources. And as a reminder, the number of Jewish settlers in the West Bank is estimated at plus 620,000 settlers, in addition to the 200,000 settlers in East Jerusalem. So this has been an instrument of war, but interestingly also, an instrument of the peace negotiations since the Oslo agreements. Since the 1990s, the Oslo agreements have institutionalized almost total resource capture by Israel under the disguise of cooperation and peace talks. So actually, due to the allocations of transboundary water resources agreed upon in Oslo II, Israel currently controls approximately 80% of water reserves in the West Bank. The Palestinians can only access 20% of the mountain aquifer annually. And according to the World Health Organization, the minimum amount of water each person requires daily is 100 liters. Israelis use 350 liters, Palestinians use only 70 liters. In 2013, Israel controlled 100% of the aquifer and abstracted 94% of its water, while Palestinians abstracted only 6%. Another side of the coin is that Israel, the water-related infrastructures are regularly subject to confiscation and demolition by Israel. In 2020, 84 of the 849 structures destroyed in the West Bank by Israel were water and sanitation structures, so-called WASH structures. According to the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, 14,000 Palestinians in approximately 180 communities in Area C, which is the area in the West Bank under total control of the Israeli army, have no connection to a water network, are without any water infrastructures. What about Gaza now? I mean, Gaza is known after Kuwait to be the most water poor region of the world. In 2020, UNICEF estimated that only 10% of the population in Gaza had direct access to clean and safe drinking water. And we're talking about drinking water. The Gaza coastal aquifer, which is shared with Israel, is the only source of water for about 2 million citizens living in the Gaza Strip. The World Bank reported in 2020 that the Gaza groundwater aquifer was rapidly deteriorating, both in terms of quality and quantity, and 90% of the available water is undrinkable. And if anyone has been to Gaza, when you drink water there, it's very salty because the seawater is seeping into the groundwater, and there's no way of rehabilitating the water that is being used by the Gazawis. In addition to that, recurring bombardment by Israel of Gaza have damaged the water infrastructure, and that is also impeding the capacity of the population of renovating its infrastructures. The blockade initiated by Israel, permanent blockade since 2007, has severely limited the material from entering, the material which is needed to upgrade the existing infrastructures after they've been bombed, actually, or because they're collapsing for lack of maintenance. In 2016, the UN reported that as many as 23 wash-related items, such as pumps, drilling equipment, and disinfectant chemicals, are on the Israeli so-called dual-use list, meaning that entry of such items in Gaza is severely restricted. There are public health consequences, of course. There is further chemical and biological contamination, which is leading to bacterial, parasitic, salmonella, shigella, cholera, and viral infections for the population. And it's worth also mentioning that there is also contamination by sewage because the sewage plants cannot be renovated or rehabilitated, in addition, in terms of the material that would be entering in Gaza. We've talked a lot about normalizations, and we heard also Dr. Ashrawi referring to the reward given to Israel by having normalization with the UAE, with Bahrain, and soon to be obviously with Saudi Arabia. It's also worth noting that Israel is also heralded as a pioneer when it comes to renewable energy. And as it's occupying the Golan Heights, Syrian Golan Heights since 1967, it's also championed as a producer of wind energy. There are wind farms in the Golan Heights, and it's also being greenwashing its environmental label, while of course preventing Palestinians and Syrians from accessing their rightful water resources. I'll move on to Yemen quickly. Yemen is another case where you have a very, very severe armed conflict, which is impacting the populations, but also the resources are being weaponized here. Since 2015, the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE has been targeting also water infrastructures, creating very severe water insecurity and scarcity for the population, also contaminating groundwater resources, but also the dual impact of food insecurity. Of course, when you have water scarcity, it's impacting your capacity to grow crops, to meet your basic needs. And in addition, there's been blockade of two of the major ports in Yemen, creating the famine also that we've seen happening, unfortunately, in Yemen, and the rise of cholera also, which used to be an eradicated disease. All of the parties have used water and food as weapons, and we know that the Houthis as well have also weaponized the access to food. Now I'll move on quickly to Syria. We know that the government and non-state actors have systematically targeted key water infrastructures to tame populations into submissions, talking about, for example, the suburbs of Damascus, but also the Northwest, which continues to be bombed until today. Recently, in the past week, it has also, received airstrikes and families being killed by the government with the support of the Russian allies since 2015. This has led to the spreading of waterborne diseases, the return of cholera as well in Syria in the past few years in the Northwest and the rest of the country. 90% of the current population lacks access to safe water resources in Syria. At one point, 35% of Syria's water treatment plants no longer functioned. Again, we remember also that ISIS was also targeting, capturing dams to also bring some, leverage in its interactions with the Syrian government and local populations. In terms of public health, the targeting of these infrastructures has also put civilians at risk, and the refineries, when they were also targeted, contaminated groundwater resources. I want to follow up now with the natural disasters that are happening. We've mentioned Libya, Derna. It's worth noting that Derna was under very heavy shelling and had experienced an armed conflict from 2014 until 2019, not allowing the maintenance of the two dams which collapsed under a heavy rainfall and creating the catastrophe, 11,000 officially, but we know many more casualties. And this is really a catastrophe when you think about how it could have been prevented. In Syria, the February earthquake that hit the south of Turkey and the northwest of Syria has created 86,000 more displaced persons, has killed, we know, 50,000 in Turkey, amongst which more than 5,000 refugees in Turkey, Syrian refugees in Turkey. And again, northwest Syria has been very severely hit in terms of access to resources, recovery operations. I'll quickly end here by saying, again, this is a natural disaster for which humanitarian assistance and recovery operations has been weaponized. We know that Russia at the United Nations Security Council has sort of conditioned access and the distribution of relief to the Northwest by having it go through Damascus, creating normalization also. We know that Syria, the Syrian president has been invited to the next COP27 by the UAE. And again, without any strings attached, without any accountability. And that is something to keep in mind that when we think about human security, the environment is never, never void of any political ramifications. And that's something to keep on the table. And because we hear, I think in terms of recommendations being in Washington, DC, I think we should call the US government and ask that the US government really sort of like keeps its allies not unchecked when it comes to greenwashing, when it comes to the violation of human rights, and also normalization now, the Biden administration acting as a mediator between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Clearly, the biggest losers in all of that are the Palestinians, are the Syrian civilians when it comes to Israel as well and Syria. And again, another recommendation, I think, is to have trust in local actors. When no one intervened in Syria, the 3-4 days which were decisive in the Northwest, because there was this weaponization and game happening at the UN, the local actors were the one actually providing relief to local populations, being very effective in doing it, and possibly trusting those local actors in future humanitarian and relief operations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marwa. This important issue of the weaponization of resources and recovery assistance in times of natural disasters, I think, is often overlooked, and thank you for highlighting it. Next, we have Ahmed, who's going to talk about governance in situations of conflict.
Well, thank you, Tamara. Thank you all. Thank you for the Arab Center for the invitation. I think one of the benefits of speaking last in a panel like this is that everything has been said and you basically don't have to add more. And I think this is a great analysis from like macro and micro areas of looking how security affects us on a daily basis. And the human security is a critical component to this. It's going to be brief. So my reflections are basically built or based on some of the research I've done at CIPRI last year, particularly a paper with colleagues on Syria, Libya, and Yemen, kind of thinking more critically or engaging with the idea of state-society relations and post-conflict dynamics. It has been a very challenging piece to write or paper to write because of the ongoing civil strife in these three countries and across the region, of course. Also, it's more reflection and observation from recent travels to China, Ukraine, and other parts of the world that has been seeing completely different understanding of what security means, governance means, and representation means. And I think I will be more kind of wanting to engage with the title, which is Democracy in Crisis. And I would say, what democracy and which crisis are we talking about? There is a crisis, of course, on so many levels, but we haven't seen real democracy in the region to begin with. And even the brief moments where we had maybe thought and hoped, and some of us were in streets of some of these capitals or the countries, have kind of died or been deflated or like went away, partially by the hands of those who went to the streets because of infighting, because of lack of understanding of what's actually to come, how to build a nation, how to engage with autocratic and deeply rooted tendencies of autocratic regimes and governance, but also, of course, by adaptation and mutation of regimes that have been entrenched in power for many, many years, and its survival is the main tool that they use. Their thinking of survival is very critical for them. So I would say that it's not necessarily democracy, it's more the representation and governance deficit and challenges that we face on a daily basis, whether this is on a family level, on a local community level, or on the state, or now even in the international level, thinking of this China-US engagement, the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and all of the what comes from that. There is also something important to mention here, if we're going to reflect and think critically about democracy and representation and what's going on in the region. There is also a Western liberal approach to settling civil wars and settling conflicts that ends with like ceasefire elections. And this kind of pivot from a ceasefire between wearing factions to let's write laws that put us all in a parliament and let's figure out a way to govern ourselves all of a sudden is kind of bizarre and doesn't make any sense. And I think this kind of approach, which is unfortunately has been pushed strongly by a country like the United States, Western Europe, even by UN agencies, have kind of created and perpetuated this failure mechanism in a way, a loophole, a self-fulfilling prophecy in thinking that if we had elections, everything would be fine. And I think we have enough track record to prove that none of this have been true. If we look as far back as the Lebanese civil war and the system that have been created afterwards, consociational sectarian system, it has eroded the idea of a welfare state. It has even eroded the idea of a capitalist state. And now we don't even have a state. So if you think of Iraq after the US invasion and the creation of a system in Iraq, it has done the same thing. All of these systems has been kept together by outside forces that are supporting these people in power, but also by local militiamen, warlords, businessmen, whatever you want to call them, who have been continuing that setup. And the people are beholden to these powers. So if you are with a certain taifa or a certain sect or a certain leader, then you will get some benefits. If you are following a certain international organization or international power, you will get some benefits. And I think part of that continues into other areas where you have a deficit, not only in governance and representation, but you have deficit of trust that also not only between the people and the governing elite or power at play, but also within themselves, within the local community themselves. And I think one of the things that we have seen or looked at in Syria, Libya, and Yemen in this paper has been the fact that they're in these difficult times where populations are being killed and attacked and left to fend for themselves, they discovered over time that the only way to figure out a path forward is to create their own social covenant, if you will, where you kind of transcend the challenges or the old hatred between some of these groups, because now they are stuck together in that piece of land. And there are examples across the three countries where it's basically in these territories that are outside the control of the state, or governance in areas of limited statehood, which is a broad set of research that has been developed over the years. You see that the way that these communities survive is by depending on each other, is by reaching across the aisle, if you will, to be able to survive that and create a mechanism that gives them some security, provision of service and goods, and protection. And then this is, if the three P's of state-society relations, social contracts, again, protection, provision of goods, and participation in this case, we see a variation of these three P's across the region. We see some countries that provide participation, but it's a participation to a certain degree. You go vote so I can become the leader, and then I do what I want. You see a provision of goods and service to a certain degree as well. Some countries are better than others, especially those who are wealthy. Gulf countries maybe, or others who have some sort of wealth and resource to be able to distribute some goods and services. And then the final one, the protection part, is used indiscriminately. And it's mainly a protection for the regime, protection of the state. And I think this comes full circle back to public security, human security as the concept that we should all kind of engage with. Because people's livelihood every day is being affected by degradation of their life on all sorts of levels. We have heard all the examples from the panelists. And it's more of that people are afraid of every single day rather than nuclear annihilation. So people die every day from gun violence, from famine, from other sorts of violence across the world. But we do not see this as a human security or a critical component of what the state should be defending for. I'd like to also mention a couple of quick points. I think I have, yeah. So we're now also seeing more, and this has been mentioned by my colleagues, the weaponization of everything, or securitization of everything, of your everyday life. Whether it's the legal framework, as Mary mentioned, whether it's regimes using force, whether it's population against each other in local and civil conflict. But this whole securitization of the spheres that are traditionally should be civilian in nature, should be conversational and discussion and communicative, is no longer there, because it's the fear tactic that has been embedded in the system and by the system. And I would say that if the saying used to be here, it's the economy stupid, and I think it's the weaponization, it's the politicization stupid. And we should not underestimate the power of politics in all and everything that we engage with every day. And I think this is another way of thinking differently and putting or using a different lens in understanding our everyday kind of engagement. I'm not going to say that there isn't a continued and growing security threats every day, whether it's security like in the traditional sense or non-traditional sense, as we mentioned, but also most of them are, particularly the non-traditional one, are being left out, and the traditional security is being exaggerated because it's the state itself or the clique or the regime itself that is kind of using that lens to maximize whatever benefits it can get. So whether it's the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, trying to maximize on what he can get, as opposed to, in the sense of coming back to the fold on some level without giving anything, or it's Israel without giving anything, or Egyptian regime without giving anything. Nobody wants to give anything, but they want to take everything. And I think that type of dynamic makes it harder on a daily basis for the population across the region to be able to be part of any of their governance or to be kind of devising tools to be part of this. And on the face of it, I believe there is a lot of chaos, uncertainty, a lot of bleakness across the region, but there is also some dynamism that's going on. I think May mentioned some, Marwa and Yara mentioned some. But some of this dynamism is not going to be seen without going deeper and deep down, delving deep down into state dynamics and local community dynamics. And I think there is a lot to be learned from doing that on a systematic basis, and forget just the macro picture. The macro picture is important, geopolitics are important, but I think looking deeper into community level engagement and dialogue is important. I'll end with one thing. At CIPRI, we have been doing some work in Iraq over the past 2 years that includes a lot of surveys and local community dialogues in northern Iraq in territories that were held previously by the Islamic State. And a couple of things come out very clearly. There is a trust deficit between the population and the state. The population or the local community do not necessarily see their other ethnic group or neighbors as a threat. They actually see that working together gets them to the next level of engagement and better livelihood. Their daily life is impacted, and it's becoming very clear from what we hear from them, is the environment and climate change. And Iraq is a clear case of all of that coming together. Little and limited resources. So little and limited resources affects job opportunities, health, and food. And the resettlement of some people. So the concept of climate refugees, basically, or internally displaced persons that will happen because of a climate disaster inside your country rather than somewhere else. And I think all of this coming together, it shows us that they are not really talking about ISIS or the atrocities of ISIS at the moment. What they care about at the moment is this day-to-day livelihood. And it's no longer that I am sitting across from a Shiite or a Sunni or a Yazidi or whoever in the community. It's that all of us are kind of facing threats that are kind of making us having to stick together rather than create these imaginary divisions that they used to have. So again, I look forward, as all of us, to more conversation and discussion on this. And thank you again very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ahmed. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So please remember to submit your questions on these cards if you're in the room, or send them via the Q&A feature on Zoom, or to our email at events@arabcenterdc.org. We'll try to take as many questions as possible. We have a few hundred people joining us online. Thank you. I think we already have too many questions for 15 minutes. But I'll start with one question for all of the panelists. All of you mentioned, community level engagement, local actors, civil society organizations that are taking the lead in the absence of governance, political leadership, accountability, even the absence of enforcement of human rights law and international law. And I have two questions for you. The first one is, how can these civil society organizations be assisted and supported to do the important work that they do? And the second question is kind of the opposite. Should these civil society organizations bear the burden of governance in these situations? We can start with whoever would like to take that. Maybe May, since you mentioned that first.
I can start, and I'm sure the panelists will want to weigh in. I think on the first, absolutely. I think Ahmed makes a very good point about the importance of paying attention to what's happening at the local level. Often we're paying attention to states and we're talking about state responsibility, and rightly so. But the reality is that in the absence of governance and the rule of law, civil society and local forms of organization do rise to the challenge. I think the question of whether they should have to is a fair one, and the answer for me is they should not. The government has a clear role to play. The ideal role for civil society is to hold government accountable and to really ask what is being done for citizens. Certainly there are opportunities to fill in small gaps here and there, but what we're seeing in local organizing and civil society in the region is much beyond that. It's filling a governance role, which civil society shouldn't have to bear. I will say though, I think it's one interesting example that hasn't been mentioned here is the example of the resistance committees in Sudan. There's been remarkable organizing. These are committees that were established at the neighborhood level to really provide services, organize, et cetera. And they evolved from organizing protests and providing services to now actually getting a seat at the negotiation table. And I think it's a really remarkable show of people power, even in the midst of so many years of having been ignored by the UN and by other actors. So I think there are interesting examples to pay attention to of what happens when that void does exist and what the potential looks like. And just a very clear answer to the question of what's the alternative. So much of the question that the US asks and that European powers ask is, so if these authoritarian leaders are gone, there's going to be a power vacuum. Terrorists are going to come, Islamists are going to come, all the scary boogeyman. But the reality is that in all of these countries, there are legitimate and realistic forms of alternate expression, organizing, et cetera. And that, yes, perhaps they need capacity building, they need supports. They're obviously not going to have the capacity of a sitting government, but they have ideas, they have vision, they have talent. And our job is to really think of ways to support them and step aside and really give them the space to do so.
Yara?
Yeah, I agree with you completely on the second one. CSOs, civil society organizations cannot bear the burden of filling in what a state is supposed to do. If we ask them to do that in situations of state fragility or state failure, we are dooming them to fail. They don't have the capacity. They're often facing repression and oppression themselves. And again, this is what a responsive government is for. For the former question, how can they be assisted? As with so many problems with the region, I think it would do, aside from funding, which the international community, that goes up and down, but it's there, adhering to the values that are preached in the halls of the UN and of the US Capitol and, in Western boardrooms and capitals across the world, which they don't do. And this is really frightening. So, I mean, just to bring up the example in Palestine, and just a year or two ago, there were these 6 civil society organizations. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. Israel raided their offices, arrested staff, closed them. And what was it? It was security, right? So even after Western governments, somebody, maybe Switzerland, someone did an investigation. They said, we find no evidence of any issues here. As of course, we assumed that they wouldn't, because this is a silencing measure on the part of Israel, as it so often does. But the Western governments that pulled funding when Israel called these civil society organizations terrorist groups did not reinstate funding once their own investigations found that there was no issue here. So you can, on the one side, say we support a strong, democracy with a robust civil society, and we're going to fund you and help you build centers. But if you are threatened in any possible way that causes us political issues, you are absolutely on your own. That sends a very strong message to authoritarians that this is something that I can do. So even these little pockets that are filling in these tiny little gaps are now continually under threat. And I mean, a lot of these organizations, we're talking about staffs of 5-10 people. Like, these are not huge multinational organizations. So I think without the international community, the term that we all love so much, can do is support, defend, adhere to their own stated values.
Anyone else would like to comment?
I just want to add a story that I heard recently about the importance of local and empowering local actors. I was on a panel on the impacts of the earthquake in Northwest Syria, and there was the head of the Syria Recovery Trust Fund, who really works with local actors and was very involved. And of course, we know the white helmets stepped in when nobody else was helping victims out of the rubbles. But what he said was very striking. He said, instead of giving grants and charity, what they've been doing is to give loans to the local populations. And they were amazed to see that 99% of those loans were systematically reimbursed by local populations. And he said, even some of the IDP, some of them refugees also, who were about to travel to Europe or somewhere else, made a point to come and meet them and reimburse. So I think the lesson here is we should really have trust in local populations and organizations and empower rather than assist only.
Thank you. And I think this note has been mentioned earlier today during the conference, that shifting back to the local populations instead of relying solely on US policy or Western democracies. But here's another question. On the other end of this, the US is still a major power and has leverage and continues to play an important role. And we have a question here about this rewards loop towards authoritarian regimes that's been mentioned throughout the day today. The reality is the US still has that leverage and that power. And the question is, how do we move away from this and encourage the United States, the UN, Western democracies to shift from this pattern with authoritarian regimes and maybe have some change? Is that even possible? Ahmed.
We all want to know the answers.
Right? Yeah. I don't have an answer, but it is possible if the mindset of the United States change. And I think because we are living we see the US system and administration, regardless Republican or Democrat, with touches here and there, it's still stuck in a paradigm of defending the world against some power or some bad power. And whether this is communism, this is Soviet Union, this is now China, it's this dichotomy of the world that sees the US as a greater good or a greater power for good, which could be. That's not the idea now that we are challenging. To make the United States taking the step that it's defending against those other ideas, those other ideologies, even if they don't exist. China does not export ideology. It's not Soviet Union back in the 60s. It's exporting a different type and model of governance, of surveillance, and of services, and economic development to some countries that want to have a similar setup without really adhering to elections, without really adhering to any rule of law or system. And I think it's an appealing model. And a lot of countries, and I just came from China, look at China as an example. You want to do certain things, you want to do miracles like China did. But the problem is those other countries as well do not realize that the China model or the American model are exceptional. They are not the norm. There is no way on earth you can replicate a US system anywhere else. It's the same way that you cannot replicate a China system anywhere else. And I think this misunderstanding put us into this dichotomy and the vicious circle of, I'm going to do this because I'm defending against this. And you can put, instead of the two words, this and this, whatever you want. And it will be the same cycle again and again and again. Intervention in Iraq against what? We don't know until today what it was for. And intervention to support some other country against the Iranian expansion. It's an intervention against communism. It's an intervention against whatever it is. And the US lens of stability at all costs is problematic, because in that way, you are perpetuating and creating a fulfilling prophecy of failure all the time. And you don't want to take responsibility for it. So what you do is you prop up these regimes. I'll stop. But when you look at the database of CIPRI's database on military expenditure on arms, you will see that the top exporters of arms are democratic Western nations who are selling arms to some of the most authoritarian countries in the world. It's not China and Russia who are selling the majority. And I'm not saying that China and Russia are great or good, but I'm saying that the numbers speak for themselves. And there is a reason behind this, not just the political reason of defending against whatever or creating favors with these regimes, but also it's an economic domestic need. The United States uses its defense budget, which is the biggest in the world, as we all know, the 9 next countries combined, to create jobs for the United States citizens and companies, to export certain models outside. And This is a way of governance and economic system that doesn't exist anywhere else. So again, going back to the main question, the US has leverage, but the US needs to change its lens and needs to understand that the world is not a dichotomy, 2D kind of system. Sorry.
Anyone else would like to comment on this? Okay, we have a lot of questions, especially about education and healthcare. I'll just maybe give you 3 questions for the last few minutes and hear some concluding remarks from everyone. Here's the question, I'm reading it now. What are the efforts, if any, to make educational changes at the university level to give students the necessary skills to be more ready for the private sector? And that's, I think, for Yara, but anybody else can also answer. There's an interesting question here about the effects of environmental disasters on the stability of regimes. This question says the earthquake in Turkey, Syria seems to have strengthened Erdogan, but there are protests in Libya in response to the flooding and the disaster that followed. Are we expecting to see these effects on regime stability in the future? And maybe one more question about, trying to read here, sorry. I'll talk about normalization with Israel. How will normalization with Israel, and I would add here maybe if the Saudis normalize, how would it impact human rights and security in the region? That's a big question, but feel free to address any of these questions and any parts of these questions, and we'll give each one of you maybe a minute. Yara, go ahead.
I'll very briefly touch on this. So the country that I'm most familiar with in terms of educational reform is in Palestine, and obviously there's a whole host of factors that prevents genuine reform at all levels there. But I also hear from colleagues across the region that there are changes being made at universities. We are seeing new medical schools, new graduate programs being built. The problem is the incentive behind some of these changes is financial. These are money-making programs for institutions, but they are making, there's no change on the back end. So you're graduating a bunch of new doctors and a bunch of new nurses and engineers and whatever, but you have done nothing in society to create a place for them to go. So you're going to see even more brain drain in the coming years. In terms of reform in the nitty-gritty of curriculum, of programming that is offered, to my knowledge, I mean, there are individual institutions or individual, more likely professors and programs at universities that attempt to make changes. But again, this perhaps more so than other types of reform, reforming education is a direct threat in many cases to the power structures of these regimes. And many of these institutions are state institutions. So I think many people are met with resistance when they try to make significant change. They become a dean, they become a provost, they try to change things, they are met with resistance, and frequently then they also leave. So then those jobs get filled with people who are more willing to toe the party line, which we can't blame them for because getting these types of jobs is hard, and then the cycle continues. So the short answer is not enough and not the right kind.
Thank you, Marwa.
Yes, regarding the management of environmental disasters, I don't know if Erdogan has been strengthened. I would have said the opposite, but it seems to me it's very important, of course, how elites and the government elites manage these disasters. Often what happens is those disasters happen in addition to a series of vulnerabilities. We're talking about regions which are traditionally the poorest, which traditionally have the highest rates of unemployment, disaffection of government funds or withdrawal of government funds. When there's drought hitting Iraq and Syria, it's not only about hitting Iraq and Syria, it's about how it's managed, how are the priorities of the communities being set forth by the government themselves, and often they're not. And you have the urban-rural divide in addition. So I think it's very important to see how these situations of crisis are managed. They do impact, but in authoritarian context, I'm not really sure it's impacting the stability, when actually the poorest and the most vulnerable are the ones hit. When they hit urban centers, the wealthy urban centers, then in that case, there would be an involvement. Now, about normalization very quickly, I think in all of these deals like Israel, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the biggest losers are the Palestinians in the end, right? Normalization used to be a very, very critical file for the Israelis in the peace negotiations. And I've worked on the peace negotiations between Israel and the Arabs and Israel and Syria. And that was what Israel was seeking through these peace negotiations. And it had to go through talks, and it had to go through concessions. It had to have a quid pro quo approach. Now it doesn't have to do any of that. And the main condition was the accountability when it comes to the Palestine question. And the Israeli government, even from Shamir to the following governments, knew that they had to tackle that issue. Today, they don't have to. They're talking about, with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Bahrain. In DC, the Abraham Accords are really heralded as a big success. It is a big loss for the Palestinians and for a lot of the civilians in the region. And I think if we bring back that accountability, then we would have effective peace. I don't believe in peace between Israel and its neighbors if it does not tackle what happened in the last 70 years, the occupation of land, the resource capture, the exile of Palestinians, the fact that you still have, more than 7 million Palestinian refugees, the occupation of the Golan Heights, etc. But this is not part of the discussions today.
Thank you. Ahmed, do you have any concluding?
No, I think for me, governance needs more representation than repression. We need more, as all of you said, empowering of local communities, more engagement on the real social protection aspects and the real tools as education, healthcare, and other social needs of these populations. We need to figure out a different methodology or path where we can push for a different understanding, particularly by the United States and other Western powers, and how they deal with traditionally their allies in the Middle East, using a human security lens. A human security lens, I think, and with a very clear description and definition that the United Nations General Assembly have actually passed, could be a way forward to engage us and make us kind of deal with a lot of these crises that we are going to face, and they are going to grow as we move forward.
Thank you. And May, you're good, right? Thanks to all the panelists for your excellent remarks and for highlighting this important issue that we wanted to bring attention to, and that is of human security. It's a gloomy picture of the state of human rights and human security in the region. And we still continue to see larger investments in military security, in arms trades, now in surveillance and digital authoritarian tools. It is a bleak picture, but we, I think, appreciate these important insights about the importance in investing in human development and human capital. And we hope to continue this important analysis and conversation. Thanks to everyone who sent in questions. Apologies if we didn't get to all of them in time. Now we have a break for 30 minutes and maybe a little less than 30 minutes, 25 minutes. And we'll come back here in 25 minutes for the final session titled, give me one second. We're focusing on the United States in the final session, U.S. democracy promotion programs and legacies, and the impacts and predictions of the 2024 presidential elections on human rights and democracy in the region. We hope to see you back in 25 minutes.